Hello, sorry about the delay. There were a little technical difficulties, but we got it. So we have Caitlin's here, and is Brad here? Let's see. Trying out, Brad's here, and is Juli here? Hi. And then Gianna. Excellent, fabulous. I'm the moderator. What we're going to do is just allow 15 minutes per person. I'll give you some warnings in the chat when you have 5 minutes left and 2 minutes left. And then we'll do Q&A at the end so that people ask questions. And then we're just going to go, in the last session, there were actually quite a lot of questions. So we had people ask questions in the chat as they went along. And so then at the end, I'm just going to go back to Caitlin, Brad, Juli, and Gianna again. So pick which one you think is the one you'd like most to do. Any questions that you guys had at all? You good? All right. That was a little exciting.
1.5 million Americans don't have health insurance, and nearly 44 million are uninsured. Premiums, deductibles, co-pays, and co-insurance have inflated the cost of health insurance, increasing steadily as technological advancements have improved, and patient demand continues to reach new heights. According to a Willis Towers Watson study, since the 1950s, so for the past 7 decades, the growth of employer health insurance premiums has outpaced the growth of total compensation by roughly 2.5 times. So this correlation, it's extremely hard to deal with for Americans who fall near the poverty line. So most minimum wage earners and other Americans who don't take home high wages are struggling for the most basic needs, obviously. Therefore, purchasing a health insurance policy is an afterthought, and getting these people quality healthcare access remains one of the forefront issues in our society today. So in order to fully comprehend the scenario, we're going to take a look at how difficult it is to make ends meet as a low wage earner through a monthly budget analysis. But first, we're going to answer the question of why healthcare is so expensive today. So one of the leading healthcare policy experts for the past 5 decades, his name is Dr. Joseph P. Newhouse. He directed the famous RAND health insurance experiment from the 1970s. And he's written extensively on cost containment strategies for healthcare. He found the main cause of the rising healthcare costs. So according to Newhouse, he states that the product the consumer is really purchasing is actually the treatment of a medical problem. The relevant cost, therefore, is the cost of treating a heart condition or appendicitis, not the cost of a hospital visit itself. So Newhouse's main point is that the technological advancements, such as the increased capabilities with treatment, with testing, with new machinery, that's attributable to the majority of the increase in medical expenditures. And then he goes further to show that the commonly mentioned causes for some of the rises in the costs, such as the aging population, the rise of health insurance coverage, increased income, administrative costs, terminally ill patients, those really don't account for the majority of the costs. It's actually patient demand that drives the costs. So diving into the budget analysis I created, it's a sensitivity breakdown that examines the budget for a minimum wage earner in Connecticut, which is where I'm located, living in 3 different housing accommodations, each with variable standards of living, below average, average, and above average. Each of the housing accommodations were retrieved from Zillow in the Hartford County. I calculated net income using a 40-hour work week for 52 weeks, so no vacation time, that's definitely rare. So keep that in mind. After taxes, the yearly disposable income, as you can see, for purchases like rent and transportation and things of that nature comes in just above $20,000. So this is the below average accommodation. And you can see the breakdown here. So on a monthly basis, the minimum wage earner is going to have just under $1,700 at their disposal. This property is $765 a month. And I used estimates on the low end of the spectrum. And keeping this in mind, other expenses and everything added up, they only leave $100, give or take, left over for discretionary items. So in this property, this person can spend on average $3 per meal for the entire month, which isn't sustainable, obviously. With one of the cheapest rent payments in the areas, this just shows that a minimum wage earner will be struggling to make ends meet at this level. And there's no room for a health insurance policy. It's just not going to be feasible for them to purchase one. Next, we're going to take a look at average. And from the pictures, it may not seem average. This definitely seems below average. Just pay attention to the pricing. It's definitely higher than the below average one in the previous slide. So this is $825 per month. And it would leave only $40 in discretionary spending at their disposal. So obviously some of these expenses can be adjusted in times of need. So for example, savings, that can be a cost that is recalculated. However, what quality of life would a person be having if they're not allowed to save or invest in their future or help themselves out on a rainy day? So it's very tight, obviously. And then lastly, here's an above average accommodation in the Hartford area. This rent payment is close to $1,000, but this is pretty average, especially in today's times with the coronavirus. Properties are definitely at a premium. And at this level, it's just unattainable. You can see he's not going to be able to afford this level of accommodation. So here's one of the main takeaways from that little sensitivity analysis. Purchasing a health insurance policy, quite frankly, when you're living within the poverty line, it's just an afterthought. It's not feasible. According to a Kaiser Family Foundation data from 2019, 58.5% of Americans actually live within 400% of the federal poverty line. That equates to about $20,000 for a 4-person family. For people struggling to make ends meet, constant worry about health expenditures carries a significant weight on their quality of life. So what's on the table exactly? And how can we solve this? So we know that American healthcare is at a crucial point in time. With our current system, as I said, nearly 28 million Americans have no health insurance and 44 million more are uninsured. So clearly changes need to be made. The main goal is to get everyone adequate insurance so that if they get sick, they themselves can pay for it. There are many possible solutions to this problem, such as universal healthcare, which has been thrown out there in politics a lot, especially as of late with the last election. The current multi-payer system that we have in place today, and compacts, that's another option that we could go down, but each has a long list of pros and cons. So what I'm calling for is to try new models and test what works. That should be the reality that we're heading towards. Maybe not implementation right at the federal level now, but perhaps on a state-by-state basis, we can test some different models and see what works, and then go from there and implement that at the federal level. The culture and the demographics of America are very dynamic. They're constantly evolving, and culture plays a huge part in insurance. Having a robust healthcare system that takes that into account and provides access to all at an affordable rate is necessary. And that's what I'm calling for mainly. So that's my presentation. Thank you guys for your time, and I look forward to seeing the others.
I'm really impressed by your willingness to tackle these very, very difficult issues and help help illuminate things for folks. Great job. Yes,
Thank you.
let's give a round of applause. I'm sorry, I think I forgot to say that before for Caitlin. All right, why don't we go on to Juli now? And keep putting your questions in the chat.
Hi, everyone. So I will apologize in advance. Apparently my university decided to mow the lawn right outside of my dorm this morning, which thankfully woke me up in time for the event. Sadly might interfere with the event. I hope you're all doing okay. So hi, I'm Juli Dajci. Just 1 second. I'll attempt to share my screen with you. And I would really much appreciate a thumbs nope, wrong screen. A thumbs up if you can actually see the PowerPoint. Perfect. It's gonna be a little awkward, but I'm gonna try to move the camera so you guys see me looking at you instead of my other monitor. Hi, so as I said, I'm Juli Dajci from the University of Hartford, a student of political science and psychology, a senior and also an international student from Albania. What I will be, I do feel a little bit like the odd one out because all of your work is very applied, tangible. Mine's a little bit more theoretical. So I'm gonna try to meet the high standard that you guys have put up for me. But thank you for that, I guess. So we'll be going ahead with motive imagery analysis and judicial behavior, which is my topic. It is essentially a subtopic of political behavior, this intersection of political scientists and psychologists that study why people engage in the political sphere the way they do. Are we still good with screen sharing? Thank you. So judicial behavior. First, I think it's very useful to have a definition for those who are not familiar with the field. Judicial behavior sort of encompasses all the theoretical and empirical efforts to decide and decipher why judges do what they do in their roles. It is a field that doesn't have that much of a long history. I think the first effort is traced back to 1948, which was the first time when a political scientist, Herman C. Pritchett, actually started investigating on whether there were some other influences on the way that judges made decisions, and it wasn't just legal factors. Ever since that time, there's been three predominant frameworks or models that have been advanced by various disciplines to try to sort of explain what influences a justice or judge's decision-making the most in the process. I'll briefly go over each model. The first one is the legal model. And in learning about the legal model, I think that's what we all expect from the justice system and from judges. The legal model says the only thing that impacts a judge's decision-making or cognition is the law. So these principles, decisions, precedents, sort of what we expect. However, as we may know, and a lot of times when it comes to a panel of judges, not everybody ends up with the same decision, even though they're using the same exact principles, even though they're using the same tools. And that's why we have developed other frameworks or models to sort of explain other varieties of influences on the judge's decision-making. One of those is the attitudinal model, which says, yes, legal precedent and all these legal principles are great and all in fun, but actually what really impacts a judge's decision-making is their ideology. And these are words that we've also heard a lot. So things such as a legal conservative or a legal liberal, that's what impacts a judge's decision-making. That's what decides the case in the end. And then the third really predominant model, for those of you who are familiar with economic theory, in particular neoclassical economics, is the rational choice model. So the rational choice model essentially says that the actor or the judge is a rational actor. They're able to choose their preferences, their strategies based on which one will satisfy them the most or whichever one will benefit them the most. Now, these are all great models. They've all been able to illuminate certain aspects of judicial behavior. However, they do provide certain limitations in that a lot of these models, the way they approach the topic is from a very singular point of view. They don't allow a lot of room for like interdisciplinarity. They don't allow a lot of room for collaboration with one another. Now, of course, myself, I am a proponent and a big supporter of the psychological perspective on judicial behavior. I myself am a student of psychology. I've been trained all these years to figure out how it influences our cognition and decision making. And the first attempt to sort of move forward the psychological perspective was by a political scientist and psychologist in 1966, who essentially examined the speeches, the private speeches of two justices, extrapolated values from there, and then saw how those values fit with their decisions. So for example, based on a speech, you'd say that this person really values individuality, and therefore he was able to find out that their decisions were always towards more individual rights rather than collective ones. But as a whole, the psychological perspective on judicial behavior is not largely supported. I think based on my analysis and literature review, it sounded a lot like a lot of the political scientists and the legal scholars sort of isolated the field from other influences. But once the economists started coming in with a rational choice model, psychologists also came in, and it provided for fertile soil for different perspectives trying to approach the same topic. But some of the most prominent contributions that we know so far are Matthew K. Hall's very recent Big Five model and Gilda Aliotta's motive imagery analysis model. Matthew K. Hall's essentially says, we're going to study the justice's Big Five model. For those of you familiar with psychology, these include traits such as openness, extroversion, neuroticism, and then see if these characteristics, which Matthew K. Hall extrapolates from the justice's written decisions, these characteristics actually impact the way they make decisions. It does find some significant associations. It is a relatively new type of work, which, it still hasn't been able to see if it withstands the test of time, and replication methods are on the way. On the other hand, Gilda Aliotta's motive imagery analysis, similar perspective. So what she did, she analyzed the testimonies that judges or nominees for Supreme Court justices give in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and extrapolated their values. Are these people mostly motivated by power, achievement, or affiliation? And then saw if these traits actually impacted in any way their way they participated. So if they dissented or concurred more. Now, Aliotta's motive imagery analysis is really fundamentally supplied on a psychological framework, that of human motivation by McClelland, which was later developed by Winters to apply to political figures. So McClelland applied it in a specifically and developed it in a specifically psychological path or sort of realm, whereas Winter was able to take that out and also provide it to the other social sciences and make these relevant findings and discussions. And then Aliotta's attempt of 1998 is essentially the first time the Winters model is applied to Supreme Court justices or to judges. And again, we can see here like sort of a visual representation of what Aliotta's model or theories were, of essentially all these types of motivations affecting the way judges behave. And the relationships she investigated, so in other words, the idea of how do you measure Supreme Court participation, you measure it through how much a justice dissents relative to the other justices they work with. How much do they concur? How much do they tend to write majority opinions? So things of that sort, other measurable variables, which we're able to sort of numerically categorize. Now, her work is really particularly interesting. And again, it's sort of the foundation for the work that I've done for my thesis, is the idea that it's a combination of both qualitative and quantitative work of content analysis, but also representing a new perspective that hasn't been discussed in quite a while. So the current study, as I said, is founded on the same thing and hypothesizes over several relationships. The dimensions of motivation will account for variation in dissenting votes, in dissenting opinion authorship, concurring opinion writing, and willingness to be the only dissenter in a case. Now, these are all really interesting ways, but I think that it's really important to see not necessarily the way justice participates as a majority person, but the way they dissent. We're currently constantly looking at dissenters to see for some guidance when we don't like a decision. So I think it's very important to look at these variables, and these are the ones that I've currently studied. The sample of justices that I've used, and I've had some limited time for this, is the Rehnquist Court, which operated from 1994 to 2005 without any personnel changes. As many of you know, judges usually change places after one retires or passes, but these people work together for 11 years, the same 9 people. As regarding dependent variables, of course, as I mentioned, we have dissenting votes, dissenting opinion authorship, concurring opinion authorship, and then willingness of being the only dissenter. So in other words, you had 8 people against you, but you were okay with that. When it comes to independent variables, of course, we're working with the 3 dimensions of motivation. So we have power motive imagery, achievement motive imagery, and affiliation motive imagery. But as I mentioned before, the issue with all the models is that they don't allow for integrated work. So I've also decided to include some ideology here. So a measure of ideology is the Martin Quinn scores, which are produced every year based on this adaptive model, and each justice is assigned a numerical value on where they stand on the spectrum. Essentially, what I'm more interested in is not whether you're conservative or liberal makes a difference, but how far away you are from that neutral point, essentially how radical you are. So I've taken the absolute values. Now, when it comes to coding for motive imagery, as you all know, you can't just ask a Supreme Court justice to take a personality test and give me their results. So the inventive, you have to be inventive at that point. One way in which you could use David Winter's scoring model is taking the justices' speeches, which are words that are produced by themselves during these testimonies, and start coding them all. Now, some of them are extremely long. I believe Justice Thomas's was about 70,000 words, but essentially you code each sentence and you look for motive imagery, and they all look different. If you see a justice that's talking a lot about their family in a warm and affiliative manner, you score it for affiliation motive. If you see a justice that talks a lot about how preoccupied they are with their opinions being excellent and meticulous, that's achievement. And if you see a justice trying to say, I'll do whatever I want, that's when you usually code for power, even though they're not as open about that. Here you can see some of the results. I can also provide the table as well as all of the data for this study to whoever is interested. But you can see some of the interesting results. One interesting observation, which I don't expand on here, is that as you can notice, when it comes to power motivation, the female justices at the time, the 2 first female justices, O'Connor and Ginsburg, actually have the lowest and I think the 7th lowest score, which I think it's interesting to see whether that's like sort of a generational effect that these as first justices tried not to show as much power motivation, or whether it's just a gender effect, and the same results would be seen if you were to code Justice Kagan, Justice Sotomayor, or Justice Barrett at the current time. So when it comes to the statistical analysis models, this is sort of what it looks like. The dependent variables, the 4 that I've mentioned, and I've run regression models on all 4 of them, and the effect of power motive, achievement motive, affiliation motive, and Martin Quinn scores. Now, this is the part where my presentation gets a little bit boring because I will show you some data tables, and I do apologize in advance. But you know, rule of thumb when you're looking at quantitative methods that I've learned is look for the stars, the little asterisks. They show you what's important. The rest will be fine. So the first model is the dissenting votes results. So essentially variances in how much justices cast a dissenting vote. So as you can see here, the regression model shows no significant relationship between any of the independent variables. So therefore, it is safe to say that null hypothesis is sort of proved for this specific sample, and we can account that dimensions of motivation, nor Martin Quinn scores, actually affect dissenting votes. I will talk a little bit later about limitations and my findings being limited, especially proof of null hypothesis because of the small number, n number. When it comes, however, to dissenting opinions, we do see significant relationships here. So what you'll end up noticing, I'm sorry, I have to check the chat, but when you're sharing that, perfect. Got it. So when you're checking here, we can see that when it comes to dissenting opinions, we do have 2 significant relationships. We have achievement motive imagery, so justices who are really preoccupied with excellence, as well as Martin Quinn scores. So essentially, the more radical you are, or the more of an ideologue you are, the more you are likely to cast a dissenting opinion. But also the model of trying to explain this behavior, as you can see below, the adjusted R-square is able to explain about 81% of the variance between dissenting opinion authorship in this model, which essentially is a very high significance value and a very high R-squared, proving that this model is really good for this explanation. So in other words, a justice who's very motivated by achievement and who's also more of an ideologue will not be shy about dissenting and sort of voicing and verbalizing the dissent they have with their colleagues if they think the opinion is wrong. As for the third model, the concurring opinion results, again, we see no significant relationships here and a very low R-squared, which proves that this might not be the right way to approach figuring out concurring opinions. However, when it comes to being the sole dissenter in a case, in other words, you have 8 people against you, you're fine with that, we see again achievement motive imagery proving having a significant relationship with this particular variable, which sort of makes sense. If a person is super preoccupied with having the right result rather than, going well with their colleagues or something along those lines, it makes sense why they would be sort of more likely to be the only dissenter. And again, we see a really good adjusted R-squared saying that achievement motivation really does explain a lot of the variation when it comes to willingness of being the sole dissenter in the case. So now that I've completed this study, and honestly, I will say this, I've gotten the results of my analysis probably the day we had to submit our PowerPoint. But it does have a lot of implications for the domain of judicial behavior. For one, it does say that you need to include the psychological perspective in it for sure. And the other one is that let's not approach this topic very in isolated manners. It's not just psychology can explain this and economy will explain that. But I think an effort should be made to sort of create integrated models. As for future avenues of research, certainly I would take it there in terms of having people collaborate with each other from distinctive fields, because what we're constantly seeing, and honestly what my literature review has revealed to me, is that each field is really good at explaining one aspect of judicial behavior, but it's sort of lacking at others. So it only makes you think what an integrated model, sort of focused and that's been clearly researched, what sort of validity that would have. Gets me really excited to talk about it. But when it comes to limitations about my method is that, of course, I have a small number of N. After all, this was part of my honors thesis. I didn't have as much time to read all these opinions. I've read about and coded about 800 pages, but a larger effort to study whether these findings are actually conclusive among a larger group of justices would give stronger sort of weight to the findings of my study, but also stronger ability to either confirm or reject the null hypothesis. And the last issue that I will mention is with affiliation motive. If you had noticed on the table, affiliation motive is scored the lowest, so it has the least frequency. And the reason for that is when going to testimony in front of Congress and the Senate, you're not usually asked about how much you love your family or how much you love your spouse or how great your life and vacations were. You're usually asked about skill, you're asked about your political or intellectual skills, so you're more able to show power motive and achievement motive as opposed to affiliation. So that's about it. Thank you so much for the presentation. Sorry if I took up a little bit too much time, but I appreciate all your ears, and I'm happy the lawnmowers didn't interrupt us. Thank you.
Round of applause. Wonderful job. I love how interdisciplinary that was. Great. Thanks. All right. And so finally, we're off to Gianna to talk about mentally ill women in prison.
Okay. Thank you, Anne. And I just want to congratulate all 3 of you on really impressive presentations. Hopefully you can all see my screen when I share. Is this visible?
I see something that has your name on it, but I don't see the presentation. I don't know if other.
How about now?
Yes, that's good.
Right. Whoops. All right. And everyone can hear me all right? Great. Okay, thank you. So good morning, everyone. My name is Gianna Fraccalvieri. I am a student at Macaulay Honors College along with Caitlin, and I attend Queens College campus. So, well, virtually. Today I'll be talking about my project titled Institutional Isolation and Injustice Among Mentally Ill Women in Prison, with a focus on Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women located in upstate New York, Westchester County. So I'd like to open this conversation with a thought that I think many, if not all of us, can relate to, especially over the past year, which is that The COVID-19 lockdown has caused people everywhere to experience some type of social isolation. And this public health crisis has caused many of us to reflect how it feels to be isolated from people that we care about and just society in general from an extended period of time. So this has led me to become interested over the past academic year in the stories of incarcerated women who have endured more forms of forced isolation than many of us will experience in our entire lifetimes. So even when the pandemic eventually comes to an end, this is like a very intense form of something that we've all had a taste of this year. So as a way of exploring the complicated connection between mental illness, incarceration, and isolation among women, I've been working on a case study of Bedford prison within the historical parameters of the 1950s to the present day. And my final project will take the form of a history paper, as I'm a history and psychology major. And I will also be adding a virtual timeline that I'll create based on when my research is finished. And that will allow students to engage with this topic visually. Okay, so I'll begin with a brief overview of my project to explain why I made certain choices regarding the parameters of the study and what my ultimate goals in the presentation today will be. So while I'm speaking, you can take a look at the Bedford Hills prison from an aerial view. So first of all, I'm focusing on incarcerated women in particular because of the long and well-known legacy of discrimination against women within the social, legal, economic, and domestic spheres of American society. I'll speak to the extent of this inequity in the criminal justice system as we go on, but just keep in mind that even though men suffer from institutional injustice as well, women have had to deal with this oppression on the basis of sex, both inside and outside of prison throughout history. So a 2006 special report from the US Department of Justice found that 73% of females in state prisons had mental health problems compared to only 55% of males. So I believe the most likely explanation for this statistic is that the mental health of females is at a greater risk both before and during incarceration. Also, I'll be using the term incarcerated women to refer to inmates who have been or are currently being held at Bedford, although I'm sensitive and respectful of the fact that this group does encompass a large group of individuals with a diverse array of sexual and gender identities. And as New York State's only maximum security prison for women, Bedford has a unique history that takes somewhat of a roller coaster ride throughout the 20th century. Its national reputation has served as everything from the model prison for women to a dark example of institutional neglect and abuse. So my interest in mental health justice for incarcerated women stems from my personal passion to work towards a future that values safe psychological treatment environments for all people, regardless of their past. And I firmly believe that access to quality mental health care is a basic human right and is essential to the process of healing. So in my thesis, I'm arguing that due to the critical situation faced by women presently in prison and the vulnerable girls of generations to come, I hope that my case study will contribute to the educational resources for both targets of institutional control and allies against it. Overall, I argue that institutions must be eradicated because they perpetuate injustice against women suffering with mental health issues. So now I'd like to take a moment to situate my argument within the larger academic conversations in this field. So I've learned about the ways in which the history of women is different from that of men by reading the work of criminal justice scholar Nicole Hahn Rafter. Her book is pictured here on the right. It's called Partial Justice, Women, Prisons, and Social Control. So in her book, she basically rewrites the record for women in a way that counters misconceptions that are held by traditional criminal justice studies that are male dominated. And she also discusses the specific reformatory phase of women's penal history at length, which marks the start of Bedford's story and addresses the role of institutions in the social control of women. So also working to expand upon and improve traditional narratives of history, legal scholar Bernard Harcourt explains how combining rates of mental hospitalizations and imprisonments paints a larger image of consistently high rates of confinement, or as he refers to it, or isolation as I'm referring to it in this project, since the 1950s. So elaborating on this concept, Anne E. Parsons also has a book here on the left, From Asylum to Prison, which adds important lenses of politics and race to this conversation, and notes that most incarcerated people diagnosed with mental illness since the 50s have been disproportionately African American and under the age of 40. So overall, this combined research supports the idea that categories of mentally ill and criminal have served parallel functions for women in American history. Moving forward, I'd like to unpack why women in prison need specialized attention, because this is a highly debated topic. So this graph is from a 2018 report called The Gender Divide, which was published by the Prison Policy Initiative activist group. This graph provides a visual of the historical development of the disparity we see between men and women's state prison growth today. It shows that the women's population has exploded to be over 9 times the size that it was in 1978, which more than doubles the rate of growth for men. So while the specific, psychological healthcare needs of women are less concrete than the physiological differences when it comes to things such as reproductive health, women require this gender-specific mental health care because social cycles of abuse disproportionately impact women and girls, especially those who are racial minorities and of low socioeconomic class. And this elevates the level of isolation and injustice that's faced by women in prison and the multifaceted issue of gender, class, race, and domestic life. Although my project focuses on mental health and social constructions of female criminality in Bedford since the 1950s, I do want to take a moment to go back a little further in history to contextualize my study. So for example, in 1909, the National Committee of Mental Hygiene headquarters was founded in Manhattan. This established New York State as the progressive leader of social reform programs and marked the ideas of social and mental hygiene, or the cleansing of what was perceived to be abnormal from society, as the national standard of treatment. 2 key players in New York's individual history is Catherine Bement Davis, pictured here in the middle, who was the first superintendent of the Bedford Reformatory, and John D. Rockefeller Jr., who opened the Laboratory of Social Hygiene on the grounds of the Reformatory. So as under Davis, the women at Bedford were subjected to experimental psychological testing and aimed to advance research connecting psychology and female criminality. So that combined with the reformatory goal of the institution at the time, which was to lift up what they refer to as the lower class of society to female purity goals of the middle class standards, created stigmas that still exist today in Bedford Hills Prison. While I maintain that my argument of mass decarceration being the best long-term defense against the tragic cyclical abuse of women in prison, I want to take a moment to examine the small triumphs towards justice that illuminate a hopeful future in which activism and overall awareness and education can lead to positive changes. So here I've included 2 newspaper headings from the New York Times from the 70s, and they highlight issues of inadequate mental health treatment and gender-based discrimination at Bedford. Even though the earlier abuse happening during the reformatory era was pretty much swept under the rug, the attention drawn by scholars and media watchdog groups helped legal action to take place starting in the 60s and 70s. In response to inhumane treatment inside Bedford, incarcerated women and their allies pursued court cases against the Department of Corrections. So this period started the standard of women being able to come forward and fight for their rights while they were also incarcerated. This is the part of my research where I take a deep dive into the complex interpretations of isolation from the perspectives of incarcerated women themselves. So I explored the personal narratives of some women who spent more than 10 years incarcerated at Bedford, including Jean Harris, Elaine Bartlett, and Donna Hilton. I also read scholarly work from inmates such as Judy Clark and Kathy Boudin, who discussed the AIDS crisis inside Bedford, as well as a report published by incarcerated women about the impact of education in prison. Many of these women have gone on to work as decarceration activists after serving time at Bedford, but their intimate accounts are a window into the disturbing power of institutions that transcend social and physical isolation by emotionally isolating women from themselves and others. Speaking to the urgency of decarceration to prevent further damage to women, Donna Hilton, who spent 27 years at Bedford, writes, "We must keep working to get the women out of prison and out of the cycle of violence in their lives and in our society. No matter what the past holds, we have to be a part of the future solution." And I feel like this embodies what I'm trying to do with my research, but also what a lot of women who were previously incarcerated are doing now as activists. In addition to the isolation faced by all women in prison, the special housing unit at Bedford seems serves as the most severe form of confinement at the prison. It's designed to punish above all else, and there are many academic conversations about the ethics of putting women who suffer from mild to severe forms of mental illness into solitary confinement, which is separate from general population. Some of the women I mentioned a moment ago discussed their own harrowing experiences in the special housing unit, or the box as it is referred to as by inmates, and refer to it in their memoirs, which I've read. I just wanted to mention this as an extreme but prevalent form of isolation that puts women in prison at a greater risk of developing or worsening existing mental illness. So taking all of this into consideration, the path of activism and reform that lies ahead is not an easy one, but it's crucial to fighting for human rights. More research, education, and overall social concern for injustice faced by women in prison will help open the eyes of citizens and policymakers alike. Women who are caught up in the criminal justice system should not be given more problems to endure by facing isolation in its extreme forms, especially while suffering with mental illnesses. And I hope that my research and the virtual timeline that I'll construct as a supplement to this project will help reform and contribute to this cause. Thank you so much for listening.
Bravo. Let's give a round of applause for Gianna. I am so impressed with what everybody's done and how interdisciplinary and thoughtful the work is. Before we go ahead and start with questions, I just wanted to put a plug in to really encourage all of you to, if you have written versions of this work, to submit it to Illuminate, the NRHC's undergraduate research journal, because I think you've really been doing very, very high quality work. And so I put that link in the chat there. Questions for Brad?
Yeah, thanks, Ann. So Juli had a question about the utilities expense that I used. It definitely was on the lower end of the spectrum. I tried to find properties that included heat and water. But yeah, so like cable, you know, a minimum wage earner wouldn't have any room for cable, Wi-Fi, you know, things to really be connected in today's society that are essentials. But those would definitely be lower on the totem pole in terms of concerns. They just don't have enough room, enough money to spend on those items. And then
Brad, if I may just expand a little bit on that question. The other thing is, even the utilities that you had included, I think you were looking at some of the lowest prices available on market. Like I was looking at cell phone, $25,
right,
monthly food expense, like $250. To me, and you can confirm this, it sounds like a starvation diet.
It definitely does. Yeah, that's a great point. Don't ask me where these prices could be found. You know, it would be really tough to get a cell phone plan for $25. But yeah, you're exactly right. You know, it's definitely unsustainable. And looking at healthcare policies, again, would be the last concern for many of these people.
You didn't include children in the mix either, right?
What's that?
You didn't include that they had children in the mix?
Exactly. This was for a single person. So I mentioned the four person family was about $20,000 a year in income. And, you know, that's right around this for a single person. So if this person had kids, you know, obviously that's a whole another ballpark to deal with. And asked, what do you think of a proposed $15 minimum wage? I'm definitely a proponent of it. The federal wage right now is about $7.25, and it hasn't been increased. Gosh, I forget, early 2000s, I think. So it's been over 10 years at least. Connecticut is 12. You know, it's not bad, but you can see through the sensitivity analysis, even 12 isn't great. It's unsustainable. Companies like Amazon, and I know Walmart is thinking about doing this as well, are raising that minimum wage to a base rate of $15. And, you know, these companies employ a huge amount of people. Many of them are that minimum wage earner. You know, that's one way where private companies can definitely play a part in this and help people out. Those were all the questions that were in the chat, but I will put my email in if anyone wants to email me anything else.
And I think you're muted, but I read your lips, and I think you said questions for Juli, so I'll take over. Okay, so I saw one question which refers to essentially, do the values remain constant for judges throughout the years since they've worked for 11 years together? Yes and no. So with respect to motive imagery, there are studies that prove that it stays constantly, relatively constant, like temporally. So as years pass, if you're a very power motivated person, barring some major shifting, life shifting event, you're gonna end up being a really power motivated person either way. There's ways to change this, but it usually stays constant. Now, there are some solutions onto how to measure like those fluctuations. So one example is, for example, if somebody was scoring me, is take different speeches that I make throughout the years and see how my scores change. We don't have that sort of privilege when it comes to Supreme Court justices. They make this one testimony and then they hide, they can do whatever they want as private citizens. And every now and then they, of course, do other things. But overall, this is the only one testimony where the document is the same for all of them. You can score all of them in the same situation, being asked relatively the same questions. Now, with respect to the motive to the Martin Quinn scores, which show ideology, of course, ideology changes. We have justices which in a year might seem to be super conservative and in another year might be quite moderate, and that shifts. That's why the Martin Quinn scores are sort of perfect for that, because they provide annual scores. So if a justice is a really conservative one year, they're going to get really conservative scores. Moderate, more moderate scores. The way I've measured them in my study, I've sort of standardized them by taking their absolute value and then averaging those scores for the years that I've studied the justices. So like 1995, 2005. That was one question. Caitlin said some nice words, so thank you. I think that is it for me. Thank you.
Okay, so I think I see one question in the chat from Juli about Gianna, what would you consider as the most effective way of decarceration activism? So there are a lot of great ways that this can be achieved, but I think through my research, I've seen that women or just people who have been incarcerated in a larger perspective who come forward and share their stories after the fact, or even during, if they have the ability to write about their experiences while still in prison, is a great way to bring what we won't really see on the news or won't hear about in academic papers because it's hard to get access to, like an insider's view of prisons, is probably the best way. And elevating those perspectives, that's something that I've tried to do through my research, because I've read a lot of memoirs, but also studies of like across time really help to show how things have changed, but also stayed the same a lot of the time. So definitely elevating women that have experienced it themselves, working together with academics who are just providing more research in this field that just needs to be expanded on as time goes on, is, I would think, the best way. Thank you for your question.
Other questions?
Yeah, I have one. It was a great presentation, Gianna. Based on this last answer that you just gave, are there restrictions in terms of, let's say, oral historians wanted to go in and talk to women in prison? Would they allow that, or would they have to kind of do it in a way that they just, I don't know, were acting like they were family members, but then they couldn't get to see a lot of people if they did that?
Right. So I'm not sure exactly from my research. I haven't, tried to get in myself and be able to speak. But I do know some of the work that I've read, there were activist groups that kind of would be corresponding regularly with inmates. So it was more like email or written letters that I've seen. But sometimes there are certain programmings that they have within prisons, like when the college classes, I don't know if I mentioned it, just like the educational availability that they have within prisons that will give sort of the window in, like, as opposed to just regular visitation that's not like a family member, because it is very, in a maximum security prison like the one that I studied, it's very difficult to, even for families sometimes, to get access. So and the whole security reason, like everything that is coming in will have to be like analyzed by the corrections officers before it gets to the inmates, but sometimes coming out, it won't be read. There's like, and that's changed over time as well. So I would like to research that more, definitely, to see how activist groups, but I know they have also like watchdog groups that I mentioned, like that will go in and like are given the rights by the state to kind of like produce a report like annually or on the conditions of, you know, mental health, physical health, sanitary conditions. And that is something that I've relied on heavily in my research too, at like from a historical perspective.
Interesting, thank you.
Other questions? I just had a question related to what you talked about related to the rates of incarceration versus numbers, right? Obviously more men were in prison, probably more men are still imprisoned
Right.
now and then. So what are like sort of the raw numbers or differences between population and gender?
So I don't have the exact figures in front of me, but I do know, like proportionately, there are much more men that are incarcerated currently, and this has been throughout history as well, where it's like the proportions that we're seeing women being incarcerated just far outnumber that of men, and that's concerning because it's you know, if you're having majority of the country is incarcerating men, where it's just a very small proportion of women, but the rate that's happening is increasing over time. That's something that's why it was alarming to me to focus on that in my research. But I could, I put my email in the chat as well. I could bring up the raw data that I was working with as well.
And again, so if you don't have this information, but what kinds of crimes are women being most incarcerated for?
So it would definitely depend on the facility. Like for a maximum security one like Bedford, for 15 to life sort of sentence, 20 to life sentence, there are a lot of domestic violence related incidents. So something that happened with like murder in response to a domestic dispute, things like that. Drug crimes are really like the number one thing that I found through my research, because in the historical period that I was focusing on, it had a lot to do with the Rockefeller drug laws that were really harsh in New York State. So for example, one of the inmates that I read about, she had one incident, first time offender with cocaine violation, and it was an A1 felony. She ended up spending almost 20 years in prison. So things like that, where the laws also have to change with social attitudes towards incarceration, is something that I focused on. But it's definitely, they're different. And throughout time, that's something that I was focusing on with the intersection between female criminality and mental illness, where in the past, something that a woman would be incarcerated for would be like prostitution, things like just deviating from female societal standards. So that's something that has changed over time, but it's still like the legacy still exists, which is why I brought it up in my research. But I think drug laws are definitely the focus of what happens for women today. Thank you for your question.
Well, let's give all our panelists a round of applause again. Congratulations, really fine work. I hope that you'll be able to join our keynote speech in 15 minutes about pathways to housing, and that you'll be able to continue in the rest of the day. I thought Gianna might be particularly interested. They're going to be having some women activists talking later this evening at 5 o'clock. So you might like that. And also just a shout out to the students that at 8 o'clock, there's going to be a dance party, 80s themed. So hope you go and get to have a chance to mix and mingle with some other people in a casual way as well. Thank you again to everyone. I really enjoyed your presentations.
Thanks, Anne. Great job, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Bye, all.